The rain had been falling for 3 days straight, thick and silver, turning the earth outside James Calder's cabin into a slow river of mud. It clung to his boots and soaked the roof until the wood groaned under the weight. He had learned to live with such sounds: rain, wind, the creak of the porch, small reminders that the world was still alive even when he no longer felt it. For years, silence had been his company, and grief his only conversation. He sat by the fire sharpening his knife, the rhythm steady, almost prayerful. Smoke curled upward in soft ribbons, and the smell of pine filled the dim room. Every corner of that cabin carried memory. His mother's woven blanket still hanging over the chair, the empty mug by the window where his father once watched the horizon. He told himself he didn't need anyone. He told himself that peace was found in solitude, though the truth was more like surrender. When the knock came, it didn't sound like a visitor. It sounded like the wind had grown desperate for attention. 3 soft raps, uneven, barely audible beneath the rain. James froze. No one ever came this far from town. He opened the door with caution, and the night's wet breath rushed in. 2 figures collapsed against his boots, women, half drowned in mud and rain. One was conscious enough to look up at him through a curtain of wet hair. The other lay still, her face pale and lips trembling. Without thinking, James bent down and lifted them both inside. The weight of their soaked clothes chilled him to the bone. He set them near the fire, their boots dripping onto the floorboards, their breaths shallow. The conscious one, her eyes dark as storm water, tried to speak but only coughed. He knelt beside her, lifting a kettle to pour warm water into a tin cup. She took it with trembling hands. "Don't ask," she rasped. "I wasn't going to," he said quietly. He tore a strip of cloth from an old shirt to wrap the other woman's arm. The wound wasn't fresh, but the fevered heat beneath her skin told him it was bad. He worked silently, jaw tight, the sound of rain filling the spaces words couldn't. Hours passed like that, him tending, her watching. The fire grew, throwing amber light across the room. Eventually, the woman stirred again and met his eyes. "They'll come for us," she whispered. "Who?" "Men who don't forget what they think they own." He felt something old stir in his chest, a warning, maybe pity. "You're safe here," he said, though he wasn't sure if that was true. The woman, Alma, he learned when the fevered one murmured her name, shook her head weakly. "If they find us, pretend I'm yours." He looked at her, unsure he'd heard right. The fire snapped between them, throwing brief light across her face, young, sharp, but tired beyond her years. "Pretend." She nodded, the shadow of a plea behind her eyes. "It'll keep us alive." He didn't argue. He just nodded once. By morning, the storm had softened, but the world outside remained gray, washed of all color. The second woman, Lydia, woke weakly, eyes fluttering open like a child frightened of light. She didn't speak. Alma sat beside her, feeding her broth from a wooden spoon, murmuring things too soft for him to hear. James busied himself at the table, pretending not to notice how their hands trembled. He had seen many kinds of wounds in his life: gunshot, blade, hunger, but none like the ones they carried. These were quiet injuries, the kind that lived behind the eyes. He wanted to ask what had driven them here, but the answer already seemed heavy enough without words. The next day, the rain returned with a vengeance. The 3 of them worked in silence. Alma insisted on helping, mending his torn sleeve, drying herbs by the fire. She moved with the quiet precision of someone who had been told to stay busy or disappear. Lydia barely spoke, but she smiled once, faintly, when James placed an extra log by her chair. That small, human thing, just a smile, felt like sunlight breaking through cloud. At night, when thunder rolled, Alma would startle awake, eyes wide. Once, she reached for his arm before pulling back, ashamed. James said nothing. He simply stoked the fire higher. The unspoken understanding between them grew heavier than any rain. On the 4th day, he saddled his horse to ride into town for supplies. Alma stood by the doorway, arms crossed. "Be careful," she said. It wasn't a warning, it was gratitude disguised as command. He tipped his hat. Always am. In town, the air smelled of mud and whiskey. Men at the saloon turned to look as he passed. Whispers drifted behind him. Calder's got women up there, someone muttered. Strays, most likely. Dangerous to keep company like that. He ignored them, but their words followed him home like shadows. When he returned, Alma was standing on the porch, her hair tied back, face pale. Someone came, she said. Riders. They didn't stop, but they circled. He glanced at the ridge beyond the pines. Even through the fog, he could see faint tracks cutting across the wet earth. His stomach turned. He tightened his jaw. You two stay inside tonight. That evening, as darkness sank and the first drops began to fall again, James cleaned his old rifle. He hadn't touched it in years, not since the fever took his family and left him with no reason to fight. But the weight of it in his hands felt strangely right, as if it had been waiting for this moment. Alma sat near the fire, mending a blanket. Lydia slept nearby, fever easing. The rain tapped gently on the window, a patient rhythm. Alma glanced at him. You think they'll come? I think men like that always come back. She nodded, then hesitated. You shouldn't risk yourself for us. James looked up. Don't reckon I got much left to lose. For a long moment neither spoke. The fire's glow painted her face in gold and shadow. Then she said, barely above a whisper, If they come, remember what I said. He leaned the rifle against the wall. You want me to pretend? She met his gaze, and there was something defiant and tender all at once. Yes. He studied her, the weight of her request hanging in the warm, rain-scented air. Then he said, I ain't good at pretending. Her eyes softened. Then maybe it won't have to be. Outside, thunder rolled over the valley. Inside, the three of them sat in silence, the fire breathing light into their faces. It was the first time in years that James didn't feel alone. He listened to the rain, to Alma's quiet breathing, to the fragile sound of hope trying to be born again. And when the next gust of wind rattled the door, he didn't flinch. He simply looked toward it and whispered to himself, almost smiling, let it come. The dawn came pale and strange, its light filtered through a mist that still carried the scent of rain and gun oil. James Calder stood on his porch with the rifle resting in his hands, eyes tracing the tree line that edged the valley. The world looked washed clean, but his gut told him peace was only pretending. Inside the cabin, Alma and Lydia moved quietly, their every motion careful, deliberate, as though sound itself might summon danger. He'd told them to keep the door barred if anything happened. They had listened, though Alma's defiance burned just beneath the surface. Her courage wasn't loud, but it was steady, and James admired it even as he feared what it might cost. Lydia had begun to walk again, though the fever had left her weak. Her eyes followed James whenever he stepped outside, a mixture of gratitude and dread. She knew he was preparing for something. By mid-morning, the valley felt too still. Even the crows kept to the woods. James was leading the horse from the stable when he heard it, the crunch of hooves on wet earth, slow and deliberate. 3 riders emerged from the fog, their oilskin coats glistening with rain, their faces hard and shadowed under wide-brimmed hats. He recognized the look of hired men, the kind that didn't ask questions, just followed orders. The one in front raised a hand. "Mornin', Calder," he called, voice rough as gravel. "You've got something that don't belong to you." James didn't move. "Ain't got much of anything left," he replied. The man smiled thinly. "2 women, come through town about a week back. Belong to Mr. Tate down south. He wants them returned." James's fingers brushed the rifle, but he didn't lift it yet. "They belong to no one." The smile vanished. "Step aside." Behind him, through the cabin window, Alma's shadow flickered, a faint shape watching, waiting. She had told him what to do if they came, to claim her as his, to make them believe she was already spoken for. But standing there now, in the chill morning with the storm creeping back from the hills, he realized this wasn't just about protection. It was about choosing what kind of man he would be when fear came knocking. He lifted the rifle. "They're mine," he said evenly. "You ride off and we forget this happened." The men laughed, sharp and humorless. "Yours, huh? You think sayin' it makes it true?" "I don't think," James said. "I know." The silence that followed was taut as wire. Then the first shot cracked through it. Wood splintered beside his head. James fired back, the sound rolling across the valley like thunder. One man fell, his horse rearing and bolting into the fog. The others dismounted, moving low, their boots sinking into the mud. James ducked behind the porch post, reloading by instinct. He hadn't fired in years, but muscle remembered what grief tried to erase. The world narrowed to breath, to rain, to the heartbeat in his ears. A second shot grazed his shoulder, tearing fabric and skin. He grunted, teeth clenched, and fired again. The bullet struck true, one man down. The last fled into the trees, shouting curses swallowed by the storm. The echo of gunfire faded into the steady hiss of rain. James lowered the rifle, his arm trembling. He hadn't realized how hard he was breathing until Alma burst through the door and ran to him, her skirts dragging through the mud. "You're hit," she said, voice sharp with fear. "It's nothin'," he muttered, though the blood said otherwise. She pressed her hand to the wound anyway, firm and trembling. "You shouldn't have done this for us." He met her gaze, those eyes, fierce even through tears. "Didn't do it for you," he said quietly. "Did it because I wanted to feel alive again." Her breath caught, and for a moment the rain seemed to fall slower, the world suspended in that fragile space between sorrow and something new. Lydia appeared behind her, pale and wide-eyed, clutching the doorframe. When she saw the bodies in the distance, she looked away, whispering a prayer under her breath. They spent the rest of the day in silence. James cleaned his wound while Alma tended the fire. Lydia gathered the strength to make stew, her hands steadying with each small motion. When they finally ate, no one spoke of what had happened. There was no need. The danger had passed, but something greater had shifted, something inside all three of them. Later, as dusk fell, Alma stepped outside. The rain had gentled into mist again, soft as breath on skin. She looked out over the valley, where fog curled around the pines, and felt a strange peace settle in her chest. For the first time in years, she wasn't running. James joined her quietly. His shoulder was bound, his movements slower now, but there was light in his eyes again. "They won't be back," he said. Alma nodded. "You sound sure." "I'm not. But I want to be." They stood together in the damp quiet, listening to the low hum of frogs waking by the creek, the whisper of rain on leaves. Then Alma said softly, "You could have sent us away when we came." "I thought about it," he admitted. "Didn't have the heart." She smiled, small but real. "Then maybe you've found it again." He looked at her, the firelight from inside catching the gold in her eyes. "Maybe I have." Inside, Lydia began to hum, a faint, trembling tune that filled the cabin like prayer. The sound of it drifted through the open door, weaving with the rain. It was the song of people learning how to live again. Weeks passed, and the valley grew green. The wounds healed. The fear thinned like fog under sunlight. James repaired the fences. Alma planted herbs by the porch. Lydia laughed when the first calf was born in the meadow. Their world became small but full, built from kindness, rebuilt from ruin. One afternoon, when the rain came softly again, Alma stood in the doorway and called his name. James looked up from the pasture, hat dripping. She held out her hand, and he walked to her without a word. The air between them felt fragile, sacred. "You ever think," she asked, "how strange it is that a storm can bring people together?" He smiled, the kind of smile that comes after long silence. "Strange, maybe. Or maybe that's the only way it ever happens." She reached up, touched his face lightly. "Then I'm glad it rained." He covered her hand with his. "So am I." Behind them, the cabin glowed warm against the gray evening. Lydia's laughter floated out through the open window, bright and alive. The world beyond might still hold danger, judgment, gossip, but here, in this quiet patch of the frontier, peace had found a place to rest. When the rain finally stopped, James looked at Alma and said, almost to himself, "Guess I'm not alone anymore." She smiled through tears. "You never were. You just forgot how to look for the light." He nodded, letting her words sink deep as roots. Together, they stood watching the last drops fall from the eaves, knowing the world would go on, tough, wild, and beautiful. And in that moment it was enough.